To start off, we'd like to go back a few years to your involvement with the Liberal Democrats. At the time, you were the party's first candidate to stand in an election. What was your appeal of politics to you?
I was interested in news and current affairs at school. I was very interested in history and modern studies. I tended to get the prizes for history and modern studies. What I didn't manage to do was to get 5 straight A's at higher or 6 straight A's, which are just, that is phenomenal. That's absolutely off the scale. And I can tell you when I was at school, nobody got that. So it was an interest in news. I used to watch every news programme. I used to read as many newspapers that I possibly could. And that's where the thirst for being interested in politics came.
And from there, what led you into the world of TV journalism?
I worked for a while for a guy who was a government minister in Scotland. This is going way back into the 1960s. His name was Dr. Dixon Mabin. He was effectively, it was the days when the Scotland office ran Scotland rather than the Scottish Parliament. The Secretary of State at the time was a very austere Presbyterian called Willie Ross. And Willie Ross was the Secretary of State for Scotland between 64 and 70. Dick Mabin was his Minister of State. And through a mutual friend, I went to work for him. He was also a private shareholder in Radio Clyde. Radio Clyde had been set up by a man called Jimmy Gordon, who's now Lord Gordon of Strathplain. And Jimmy Gordon, coincidentally, was the first ever political editor at STV. He left STV in 1972 to set up Radio Clyde. So he had sort of pointed me in the direction of journalism. And after I stood in the aforementioned election, both the BBC and STV approached me to work for them. And as things transpired, I went to work for the BBC for about a year and a half before I transferred to STV, because in those days commercial television paid a lot more than the BBC. Not the case now.
No, that's definitely true. So in your current role at STV, what's it like behind the scenes, and how do you prepare for each interview?
Most interviews are fairly short. They don't last terribly long. You don't need to do a great deal of preparation. And I gather you're the First Minister in the school quite recently. No doubt she was making herself available for interview. When politicians do visits to schools, I'm afraid we never really asked them about the school, because it's not really where we're interested in. So if she was interviewed here, she might have been asked her views on Brexit or something like that. Proportional representation, indeed. If it's an election and you're doing a very long interview, a half-hour interview with a politician, there are a number of things you do for that. The first thing is that you read what they're standing on. You see what the fault lines are in what they're proposing, where you think the things may well be weak, because it's our job to provide a public service for our viewers to help inform them about the choices that they make at election time. So part and parcel of that is actually ensuring that what politicians promise, that it actually can be delivered, that it actually stands up. So, for example, the current Scottish Government said at one time that they would scrap the council tax. The council tax is still with us. They said at one time they were going to scrap all student debt. Students still leave university here with levels of debt. It's those kind of promises that politicians make that I have to make an assessment. Is that achievable? Is it not? And conduct interviews on stress points and manifestos, which the viewer can look at, and hopefully it helps them make their choice at election day.
In the whole host of election campaigns you've covered, who's been the most interesting person you've ever interviewed?
I haven't really, there's not one that absolutely stands out.
At all.
There's not, no, it's not so much that. I mean, there is no one individual that I would say was interesting. Probably of all the people I've interviewed, the most, and it's partly because, I mean, I seem to be with them day-to-day basis. Donald Dewar, the First Minister of Scotland, I first met actually in 1981, and when I went into journalism, I seemed to interview him every other day. He was the Shadow Scottish Secretary. It was back in the days before the Scottish Parliament, so he was a permanent fixture. Alex Salmond was elected SNP leader first time around in 1990, defeated the favourite Margaret Ewing, and all the party establishment were behind Margaret Ewing. They weren't behind Alex Salmond. So his first period of SNP leader coincided with the time when I joined Scottish Television, and obviously he became First Minister in 2007. I've lost count of the number of times I've interviewed Alex Salmond, and probably next to him, Donald Dewar would be the individual that I interviewed most as well. They were both very, very different kind of individuals in personality terms and in political terms.
So our school newspaper, the Oystercatcher, has recently relaunched for the school year. Do you have any advice for our budding journalists?
Yes, write about what interests you. That's the great thing. I mean, I always say to people who want to go into journalism, if your passion is football or sport, write about football or sport, or talk about football or sport. If your passion is politics, then gravitate towards politics. There's absolutely no point in trying to write. Let's say, for example, you ask someone to do a feature article on a teacher. If you're not particularly interested in that kind of stuff, then don't do it. So the key thing is what you're interested in, but what you're interested in will come alive in how you talk about it and how you write about it.
And just before you go, we've heard you're a film fanatic, so what is your favourite film of all time?
12 Angry Men. 12 Angry Men was a film about an individual who was guilty as sin, or so we thought, and Henry Fonda was the sceptical juror who, by the force of bludgeoning logic, managed to persuade every other juror that the individual who was charged with the crime in actual fact was not guilty. It's a very good moral.
I like the sound of that.
Excellent. So thank you very much, Bernard, for joining us here.
Thank you.
To see
Not
us
at all.
quite soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.